Hello, this is Unsung with GameLeap, and in today's video we're going to be doing our full rundown of patch 13.21, and we're also going to be updating our tier list as we go. There are a few changes in this patch that are really going to hurt some of our previous placements, so we want to give you guys the highest quality information in advance. Some of the highlights to this patch include nerfs to Hullbreaker, nerfs to Jinx, and nerfs to Briar, which are completely dominating solo queue at the moment. That being said, let's go ahead and get right into this patch, starting with these system changes. First and foremost, Riot is not happy with the state of jungle at the moment. A lot of AD junglers really fell off with the first iteration of this patch, so they're trying to put some power back into them. Now your jungle companion has 2% more AP scaling and 10% bonus AD scaling, meaning that the jungle isn't going to be completely dominated by tanks and AP champions like Fiddlesticks. While buffs to AD junglers are kind of an indirect nerf to Fiddlesticks, this champion is still going to remain the top tier, best jungler in the game once we master his unique playstyle. This champion really doesn't require too much knowledge and is completely disgusting in the slower paced game. The best 3 AD junglers in the game, however, Briar, Graves, and Nocturne are still going to remain just as strong. Nocturne might actually go up a little bit in priority after these changes ship, but for the most part we'll probably see a resurgence of J4, Hecarim, and Rek'Sai due to these changes. Since the first iteration of this change was a blanket nerf, there's actually not going to be too much movement in the tier list. All these champions are already relatively strong, and of course the entire jungle role as a whole got nerfed, so the power level of the champions remained about the same. Overall, all these changes are trying to do is make AP junglers just a little bit stronger while they're already pretty strong, and make AD junglers a little bit more competitive where they need to be. Currently, our 3 top tier AD junglers just eclipse everything. This is overall a positive change, which means that you'll be able to blind pick more fun junglers that you want to actually play instead of what's overpowered on the patch. Now that we covered the jungle, let's go ahead and talk runes. First Strike has received a massive nerf of -1% on the bonus damage. Honestly, this nerf is not that significant. First Strike isn't actually going to be an early game rune. This rune is mostly geared towards the mid game and somewhat towards the late game when we're at that 4 and 5 item mark. The reason for this is that we're more likely to hit our combos in the mid to late game than we are in the absolute early game. Sometimes you will eke out with like a kill in the ultra early game if you're trading on cooldown with a high burst champion like Talon, but for the most part this is quite uncommon, and this nerf won't really nerf First Strike in a meaningful way. This rune is still going to be good in the mid game. You're still going to have access to the insanely strong inspiration tree, and for these reasons I do not think that this nerf is going to be meaningful at all in the slightest. Phase Rush is also being nerfed, but solely for melee champions. This is a pretty uncommon change for Riot. Normally when Phase Rush or runes like this are nerfed, it's geared more towards ranged champions. However, there is one champion in particular that is getting this rune nerfed more than others, and that's going to be Garen. Garen is without a doubt one of the biggest winners of these anti-snowball patches, simply due to the fact that he doesn't need gold to scale as much as other champions. Instead, he relies primarily on levels. Phase Rush giving so much movement speed and having such a strong slow reduction allows Garen to kind of cheat the early game more so than he was able to before. People are also starting to run this on a lot more of the bruiser top laners, and it's turning out to be a little bit problematic, so Riot's nipping it in the bud early. This, however, won't affect Garen's placement whatsoever. This champion is still going to be strong as long as his numbers are as high as they are, and a 5% reduction on early game Phase Rush won't do much to stop him. Now that we covered our runes, let's go ahead and look at Hullbreaker. Hullbreaker is receiving a resistance nerf in the late game for both melee and ranged champions. This would be a good solution to this item if it wasn't already rear-loaded. One of the first few nerfs to Hullbreaker rear-loaded the scaling, meaning that you gain more armor and MR at level 18 than you do at level 15, for example. The nerf for Hullbreaker is geared primarily towards the late game where this item is relatively balanced. You're going to be split pushing a lot less, you're going to have to group for objectives, and you're not going to be constantly getting the most out of the resistances. In the mid game, however, this item is going to be basically just as strong as it was before. It's going to get tuned down just a tad, but those resistances could need another chopping. To be quite honest, the nerfs to this item are pretty pathetic. I was hoping for a little bit more, but who knows, the itemization update is geared to come in like 13.22 or 13.23. Hopefully this item won't be as problematic in the future. Now that all the system and itemization changes are out of the way, let's go ahead and talk champions. Aurelion Sol is the first on our list for this week. This champion is receiving a pretty harsh nerf. He's essentially losing 20% of his Q's damage whenever he's holding it down. This champion is really strong, he's mostly blindable, and he does good damage right now. The anti-snowball changes definitely benefited him a massive amount, simply due to the fact that he's able to scale more often now. After these nerfs, however, Aurelion is surely going to drop at least one tier. If his E simply wasn't so good, he would definitely be dropping another tier as well, but seeing how Aurelion's E isn't being touched and they're only hitting his Q's DPS, we're still going to be able to scale, we're still going to be able to stall games, and we're still going to be able to pull waves with ease. For these reasons, I'm going to move Aurelion Sol down from broken tier to simply strong tier. Briar is our next champion in the OP tier that is going to be receiving some nerfs. However, they are actually quite light. Her damage in W2 is going to be slightly reduced if you're going the lethality Briar build. However, the value on this is still really high. way higher than it should be. The next nerf to Briar is going to be geared towards her attack speed growth. They're reducing this by 0.3%, it's not really that significant. With these two nerfs, we're also receiving a buff for Briar in lane. They're simply upping her passive healing just a tiny bit on her bleed. These changes aren't really going to move Briar around too much. She's still going to be decent top lane, she's going to be really strong mid if we have a decent matchup, and she is definitely going to remain completely overpowered in the jungle. Until we see an actual nerf to this champion that has some substance behind it, Briar is going to remain in OP tier. you need to abuse this champion while you have the chance. Caitlyn is our next champion on our list. This champion is receiving a nerf to lethality Kate and hopefully a buff towards crit Kate. Headshot is receiving a minor buff which scales your critical strike chance, but most importantly, Ace in the Hole is receiving an entire slew of nerfs. They're increasing the cooldown to 90 seconds at rank 2 and 3, they're reducing the amount of physical damage that it deals, both the scaling and the flat damage, while slightly buffing the critical strike chance ratio to compensate. Oh man, these changes really hurt. Honestly, lethality Caitlyn is 100% dead after these, but normal crit Caitlyn is also going to suffer. This is a more scaling oriented build and it will harm you in the mid game where Kate is already at her weakest. This champion might just plummet down the tier list again. It's a little too early to say exactly how much is going to harm her, but the current ADC meta is not friendly to Caitlyn as is, so we'll have to see where she lands. Mundo is going to be our next champion on the nerf list. Mundo is strong this patch largely because of Grasp of the Undying and the Resolve tree as a whole. This rune tree hasn't been nerfed at all and has led to a rise of champions that take Grasp. Even Jax is swapping over to it as his most picked rune page. Mundo, being an HP scaling juggernaut, is of course one of the biggest benefactors of these changes. This champion is definitely stronger than he normally is, but as you can see from last week's tier list, we don't have him rated super high. This is primarily due to the fact that Mundo is a low elo stomper more than anything. There's a bunch of champions that we could pick into him, such as Vayne, Camille, and the like, that have a good time into Mundo. He's a jug by design, so he's easily kiteable, and his weaker than average scaling definitely does not make up for this weakness. A champion like Fiora or even Garen is going to be more of a threat than Mundo is in the ultra late game, so I think that we're going to be leaving Mundo where he's at. Now that we covered Mundo, let's go ahead and move on to Jinx. Jinx was 100% overbuffed last patch, and you guys have surely seen a rise in her pick rate. With us playing solo queue, there's a lot of kills that are going to be happening around the map, which means that Jinx gets a lot of passive stacks. The nerfs to Jinx are going to primarily focus on reducing the amount of passive stacks that she's able to get, and reduce the frequency of Jinx solo ending a game. Currently, if she gets an inhib tower at the inhib, and then goes through your Nexus turrets, they're generally going to fall really quickly because of how high her passive stacks. It's going to be impossible to fight her in your base as well, seeing how she has all this bonus attack speed. Riot really doesn't like the fact that she's able to do this, so they're making it so that way structures and epic monster kills only grant one stack of Get Excited. They will not grant any more stacks beyond the first. If we take down a structure, it'll instead refresh the buff, but not give us bonus attack speed. The stacks here are also being capped at 5 instead of previously unlimited. The nerfs to Jinx passive really won't matter in the long run. The champion is still really strong. The ulti cooldown reduction as well as the scaling changes to her will make her a solid pick for the rest of the season. We're going to be keeping Jinx in the OP tier because of this. And finally, last but not least for our nerf list, we have Rammus. Powerball is receiving a nerf to its damage in the early game, they're reducing it by 20 points exactly. Defensive Ball Curl Rammus's W is receiving a 5 armor nerf as well as a nerf to 5% of the total armor scaling. This champ is good, he's still going to be oppressive into all AD comps, but of course he's going to struggle against a plethora of AP junglers that are present right now. If we spam gank on Rammus, it's easy to close out games and cheese them out, especially in lower elo, so we're actually going to be moving him up a tier simply because AD champions are receiving a buff to their pet scaling and the armor and MR bonuses aren't going anywhere. With Rammus being done, that covers all the nerfs. Let's go ahead and talk about buffs now. If you ever want to learn any of the champions present in the patch notes, head on over to gamelink.com. I have tips and tricks videos up for every single one of these champions. Make sure that you go and check them out now. Bel'Veth is going to be our first champion on the buff list here. When they ship the nerfs to Bel'Veth, they hit her early game a little too hard. Her scaling is still great, but she's not able to dominate like she was before. To remedy this situation without overbuffing her, they're simply reducing the cooldown on Bel'Veth's early game E by 4 seconds and then reducing it further by 2 seconds in the ultra late game. Even though all these nerfs came through, we still have Bel'Veth rated pretty high in the old tier list. Her early game and her invades are 100% nerfed, but her scaling is still top notch if we're able to hit that mid game portion of the game. Kraken into Stride is still going to be her best build, and this champion is really strong once we hit that point. It's just hitting that point is a little bit more difficult than it was before. A rise of 80 junglers might make this champion drop, but I think that she's going to remain in just about the same spot. These E changes alone won't shift her into OP tier, and they're definitely not going to be making her weaker, so she'll keep the same placement. Hecarim is next up on our buff list. This champion is still without a doubt S tier if you build him the right way. Riot even addresses this OP build directly in this blurb here, but he's still receiving some buffs regardless. Their buffing is 80 growth by 0.5, this is small but will affect your Sheen builds, and they're increasing the duration on Spirit of Dread by 1 second, making him a little bit more durable where he needs to be. Hopefully these changes will keep Hecarim closer to a fighter and not overbuff the OP build that is currently circulating. These buffs, the new build as well as the buffs to the jungle pets, are definitely going to move Hecarim a little bit further up the tier list than before, maybe where Zac was previously, and definitely ahead of J4. We'll have to see when the patch lands if the OP build is still going to be that much more dominant over the regular fighter build, and if the buffs to the jungle pets will accelerate him into OP tier. K'Sante is receiving buffs to essentially every single one of his abilities. The passive is getting a massive damage increase during All Out. The required amount of bonus health for the cast time on Antofo strikes has also been reduced, allowing him to scale a little bit earlier on into the game. Pathmaker can be charged for longer, allowing us to have a larger damage reduction window, and All Out is going to heal us for more of the damage that we deal. Unfortunately, all these buffs and nerfs to K'Sante have only weakened him in pro play and kept him relatively the same in lower elos. I would recommend that you don't actually play this champion unless you find his design really cool. In his current state, he's not going to be worth the time and effort to learn. Cassante is going to be remaining in C tier. LeBlanc is next on the buff list here. This champion got overnerfed in 13.20, she was still really good in mid lane if we had the appropriate matchup, and the meta is decent for her. She does okay into Kassadin, she does pretty well into Sylas and the like, so it's kind of hard to say that this champion is outright bad. She definitely gets way better the higher that you climb, but she's going to be effective in just about all elos. The buff here that she's receiving is actually pretty fat. They're giving her 10% extra AP ratio on Distortion, and the second cast of Ethereal Chains is also giving us an extra 10% ratio. I don't think that these changes are going to affect LeBlanc that much. She's still going to win the same matchups, she's still going to lose to Orianna, and we're still going to have to hit all of our spells in order to get an assassination. Next up is Master Yi. Yi is receiving minus 4 seconds on his E's cooldown. This is not going to do anything significant to change this champion's placement. Zero movement here as well. Morgana is receiving some jungle-oriented buffs. Both the flat magic damage and the monster damage modifier on her W, Tormented Shadow, are being increased. Morgana jungle actually went to playable tier on the last patch. We didn't have her on the last tier list simply due to the fact that it's going to be a fringe and niche pick, but now it looks like she's actually going to be quite competitive. I'm going to be placing Morgana at the top of A tier and maybe even the bottom of S, simply due to how effective this champion was before. However, we're going to need some more data to see if this champion actually lands in a strong spot or not. Tahm Kench is the next champion on our buff list. They're reducing his passive magic damage in the early game, but increasing the gold scaling that it receives, and they're also increasing the cooldown refund on champion hit on his W once we have some points in the skill. To be honest, Kench top is pretty weak. It's going to remain pretty weak as long as there's so many percentage damage dealers in the top lane, and Hullbreaker being a viable item only shuts him down even further. I don't think that we'll see much movement from this champion. Maybe he'll go from C to B tier, but just the very bottom of B if anything. Kench has always been strongest in the early game, especially post level 3. These changes are mostly geared towards post level 11 where Kench already falls off. And finally, last but not least on our buff list is going to be Varus. Overall, every Varus build is pretty weak at the moment. AP Varus got nerfed a while back, Poke Varus has not been strong for quite some time, and Varus is too immobile to make use out of the on-hit build at the moment. They're upping the magic damage on Varus's W to compensate the on-hit build and the AP build just a tad, and they're also increasing the slow on Varus's E, Hail of Arrows, by 5%. These are really minor buffs to the champion, and they're not going to do much to change the current bot lane meta. If we want to play an immobile carry, Jinx does it better. If we want to play something that has a good scaling and bullying potential, Ezreal pokes just as hard, and Ashe is going to be the more consistent engage option. For these reasons, we're going to be leaving Varus in average tier. Now that we talked about the outright buffs, let's go ahead and talk about the adjustment champions. Riot is trying to move Brand away from support just a tad and making other roles viable for him. Brand Jungle is without a doubt receiving the largest buffs here. They are massively ramping the damage on his passive Blaze Up against monsters. His E, Conflagration, is receiving a slight nerf to prevent support Brand from running away with all these buffs, and mid Brand is receiving a higher amount of base armor as well as a higher amount of base attack speed. These honestly look like outright buffs to me in all roles, even support, so I would imagine that Brand is going to go in average tier in all three roles. Seraphine has an entire wall of text dedicated to what they're doing to her. Essentially, the TLDR is that they want to nerf Seraphine in the AP carry role, bring up support Seraphine's power, and also keep her at about the same place for mid lane. The way that they're doing this is by raising the base damage on her Q by reducing the scaling. They're increasing the base value and the total amount of scaling on her W, and also buffing the damage on her E. Her health and armor are getting a buff as well, so she'll be a little bit tankier when using her own shields. Any change to nerf AP carry Seraphine in my eyes is going to be a good change. It's so frustrating to play against in high elo games, and people aren't abusing it just because they like the character. If actual Seraphine mains get more enjoyment and playtime out of these changes, I see it as a win-win. It's a nerf to AP carry Seraphine, and then she's going to be brought up in her other two weaker roles. On the tier list, we'll move Enchanter Seraphine from C tier to A tier. We'll keep mid lane Seraphine in the same spot, and then hopefully we can knock down ADC Seraphine from S tier to good tier. Now that we covered Seraphine, let's go ahead and move on to Zyra. Zyra is going to be the last champion on this patch video, and Riot primarily wants to shift her to being a viable jungler. In order to do this, they're bringing up her base attack speed, they're increasing the amount of damage that her passive does later in the game via AP scaling, her Q's magic damage is outright going to be higher, with a 5% higher scaling as well, and her Grasping Roots is receiving a 40 base damage nerf at max rank for an additional 10% scaling, which will even out later on into the game. After these changes, I hate to say it, Zyra jungle is still going to suck. It's not going to be a viable role for her, but mid lane Zyra might stand a chance. Champions like Kassadin, Neeko, Orianna, and Syndra completely dumpster Zyra mid, so we'll move her to C tier and see where that lands. Honestly, Zyra mid could be a really good pick in lower elo games, but Zyra jungle is definitely not going to go anywhere. And these changes are definitely going to be a nerf to Zyra support, which is already kind of in an awkward spot. For now, we're going to keep Zyra support in the exact same place. Anyways, this is Unsung with Gamely. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video.